Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this discussion hosted by the program on extremism here at George Washington University. My name, for those of you that don't know me, is Sergio Altuna, senior fellow here at the program, and I am honored really to moderate today's event titled ISIS, al-Qaeda, and the Iran War. The structure of the event, for those of you not familiar with it, will be quite simple. It will run for approximately 75 minutes. Each panelist will deliver a 15-minute presentation on various aspects of the main topic. Then following these presentations, we will transition into a Q&A session where our panelists will have the opportunity to address questions from the audience. Of course, I do encourage you to actively participate. You can submit your questions through the chat feature. And we always hope, as I always say, we hope this interactive format to allow for a very dynamic exchange. And we look forward to your insightful queries. Really excited, as I said, to facilitate this timely event with our esteemed panelists, to whom I'd like to extend my warmest welcome. Before diving into the discussion, just allow me to introduce them in the order they will speak. Today at the program on extremism, we have Dr. Sarah Harmouche, who's the CEO of H9 Defense, a national security research consultancy specializing in counterterrorism and geopolitical risk analysis. Thank you very much, Sarah, for being here with us today. And Mr. Colin Smith, who was coordinator of the analytical support and sanctions monitoring team at the United Nations Security Council. Thank you very much to you both for having accepted our invitation. Now, allow me to offer a brief introduction before giving the stage to our guests. Over recent months, and for obvious reasons, of course, the war in Iran has been examined from many angles: geopolitical, diplomatic, energy related, and of course, each of these lenses offers critical insights, and rightly so. However, we at the POE believe that there's another dimension, another issue that has remained a bit off the main stage during this period. And I'm specifically referring to global jihadism. And even though it's not grabbing headlines, if history has taught us anything, it is that some of the most significant gains for such actors occur not directly in the battlefield, but in the shadows of conflicts dominated by others. See, when they are out of the main focus, of the main picture. Jihadist organizations, global jihadi organizations, as we know from decades of research, are incredibly good at adapting to the context. And when we talk about adaptation, we tend to focus on the operational side, changes in tactics and structure, in how they control territory, governance, you name it. There's another level that matters just as much, and this is the discursive level, narrative, propaganda. And as a matter of fact, strategic shifts often appear in discourse before they appear in operations. We see changes in emphasis, in tone, in enemy prioritization, usually precede shifts in targeting patterns, in recruitment strategies, mobilization pathways. So, given how central discourse and propaganda are to these groups, earlier this year at POE, we launched a new project we've been working on for a long time, the Titan project. Titan, which, by the way, stands for Terrorism Insight Through the Analysis of Narratives, this acronym, I would define as an innovative research project through which we try to systematically analyze the narratives of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State using corpus linguistics and computational linguistics. I won't bore you with the technical details, but in essence, we're talking about a very large-scale Arabic language corpus representative of jihadist discourse of jihadist social acts over time. Basically, everything these groups have officially published in written, audio, or video format. You might call that big data right now. Well, we've been working in this project with the aim of pushing the limits of our understanding uh, of jihadi strategic communications and how jihadist narratives evolve. And although we've already published a few pieces, which I encourage you to look at for using this massive data set. We've been working with, I mean, since the beginning of the war in Iran in late February 2026. uh, we saw in that an event that pushed us to focus a bit more directly on this issue in particular. We wanted to examine how these organizations were responding to the war, or to the war in general, and to Shiism and Iran in particular. Now, as most of you probably know, sectarianism is one of the defining features of jihadist ideology, particularly so in the case of the Islamic State. But as we started looking more closely at the issue, we realized that the actual weight of anti-Shia rhetoric, anti-Shia narratives across time and across organizations and context was far less clear than many people assume, basically. So we decided to use the current context as an opportunity, quote unquote, to produce a couple of research pieces. The first one focuses on analyzing the relative weight of Shia and Iran-related issues within each organization's propaganda ecosystem. And for that, we worked with a huge sample of all propaganda products issued by the central apparatuses of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State between 2020 and 2025. That's 6 years of time span. So this first piece gave us some very interesting findings, which I'll share with you in a moment, of course. But more importantly, uh, it also established a baseline. And that baseline then allow us to go to a second piece to compare how both organizations adapt their messaging from the weeks preceding the war up to the present moment. So what the data immediately showed us when we started working on that baseline, sorry, is that although sectarianism is often treated as a defining feature of global jihadism as a whole, uh, reality as usual is much more complex, much more uneven, and that unevenness is important. That unevenness matters because once you stop looking at jihadism as a monolith and start examining how different organizations actually communicate over time, eh, this growing gaps between them looks even clearer, and different strategic cultures begin to emerge. What we tried to do was relatively simple. We want to measure the visibility, if I may, of Shia and Iran related themes within their official propaganda ecosystems, not just like anecdotal references, not isolated statements after an attack, but the broader communicative architecture over a 6 year period. And the contrast was, quite frankly, sharper than we expected. So for the Islamic State, I'll try to go organization after organization and then try to be focusing on a bit of a comparison between both. For the Islamic State, sectarianism is not just present, it functions as really one of the central organizing principles of its discourse. Shia communities, Iran, and what they consistently describe as Rafida or al-Mashru' al-Safawi, the Safavid project, are woven into a very dense enemy architecture that appears across operational claims, theological justification, strategic messaging, mobilization narratives. In other words, I mean, sectarianism is, in ISIS discourse, is structural. And that has important implications because in ISIS propaganda, Iran is not just treated as a geopolitical rival or as a state actor competing for influence in the region. It is almost like a civilizational antagonist embedded into the group's worldview. It is repeatedly framed as an internal threat more dangerous than the far enemy, like meaning more dangerous than the West or the USA itself in certain contexts, which is, I mean, something when it comes to enemies in jihadist worldview. Now, obviously, uh, this is not entirely new. We already knew that sectarian hostility has long to occupy a central place in ISIS ideology. You can really trace it back to Zarqawi's times in Iraq and the early disputes that later contributed to the split between both organizations. But what the data set allowed us to see much more clearly was the consistency of that prioritization across time. Like even during periods where operational focus shifted geographically, like towards Africa or Afghanistan, this same sectarian framework remained remarkably stable. But basically, our data actually shows that Shia-related references make up to almost a quarter of all enemy categories in ISIS propaganda. That's like the second most mentioned enemy, just behind local regimes, and basically uh, on top of the West in general. Surprisingly enough, I mean, that's even above other sworn enemies like US or Israel. Al-Qaeda, meanwhile, uh, presents a starkly different picture. And I think this is one of the most important findings of the report. Because if you approach Al-Qaeda expecting the same sectarian saturation they see in ISIS materials, you simply don't find it. During this period of study, 2020 2025, uh, references to Shia actors or Iran, they certainly exist, but they appear like far more selectively, uh, far more conditionally, and definitely usually or often, very often subordinated to broader strategic priorities. In practical terms, that means that Al-Qaeda attempts to frame conflict less through an explicitly sectarian lens and more through broader narratives centered on Western intervention, occupation, Palestine, governance failures, local grievances, you name it. Sectarian language, it is indeed available to the organization and sometimes very aggressively so, but it is not constantly foregrounded in the way it is with ISIS. So what happened when we tried to assess the importance of Shia and Iran within Al-Qaeda's hierarchy of enemies is that, well, we got a very different picture. Like Shia-related content accounts for less than 1% of their enemy references compared to that 22% of ISIS. And I don't want to drive you crazy with data, but key derogatory terms like Rawafid or Majus or Safawi are almost completely absent, which of course, as you can imagine, is nothing like what we see with ISIS. And and this distinction tells us something important about how both groups think strategically. When it comes to Shia and Iran, ISIS tends to operate through doctrinal rigidity and like communicative clarity. Its messaging is discipline, highly repetitive, and intentionally binary. That's right. It tells its audience exactly who the enemy is, where legitimacy lies, and how events should be interpreted. Very important. And that rigidity obviously creates some operational limitations and political limitations, but it also creates a very powerful mobilizing structure. Al-Qaeda, by contrast, has historically operated with a much greater degree of strategic elasticity. Can I say that? Its messaging adapts more carefully to local realities, to coalition building needs, political constraints. In some environments, aggressively sectarian rhetoric may help mobilization, but in others, it may alienate local populations or fracture alliances or undermine broader objectives. So, what's inferred from our baseline study is that sectarianism as not simply an ideological constant, like equally activated across the jihadist field. It has become something much more instrumental. It is selectively emphasized, strategically calibrated, and definitely embedded within different organizational logics. And Iran, of course, becomes a clear point where these differences crystallize. Like for ISIS, Iran is like comfortably inside its already existing sectarian framework and occupies a central place in the organization's worldview. For al-Qaeda, Iran creates tension. I think Dr. Harmoush will explain further this point because ideologically, Shiism remains deeply problematic within Salafi jihadist thought. Of course, operationally and strategically, the relationship becomes more complicated. And this is where the current conflict becomes, as I said before, quote unquote, analytically useful. Because with the baseline, we basically have a map of how these themes normally function inside each organization's propaganda under, I'd say, relatively stable conditions. So the obvious next question was, what happens when Iran suddenly moves to the center of the focus, to the center of regional attention? And that is where we can observe what changes and equally important, what does not change. And what's what we looked at on our second report. So the core argument of the second report was or is relatively straightforward. The current escalation acts as a moment of exposure for global jihadist actors. I mean, it reduces space for ambiguity in front of their target audiences and forces organizations to communicate. And what we found is that under the current conditions, the divergence between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State becomes even sharper. So for ISIS, the current war, functions as a confirmation. The organization does not need to substantially rethink its framework because already, I mean, Iran already occupied a very central position within its enemy hierarchy, like long before the current escalation. What changes maybe is the intensity. Now its messaging has become much more aggressive in every new Al-Naba op-ed. It's newsletter they publish weekly, more repetitive and more centered on them. I mean, of the 9 issues of these weekly newsletter have been published between late February and May, 1st of May, maybe late April. I forgot the last issue we took into account. But basically, out of those 9, 8 explicitly address Iran or the Shia axis, and most of them, by the way, as a central theme. Iran and Shia Muslims have moved to the very center of the organization's interpretive model of the conflict. And quite importantly, in my opinion, ISIS presents this as a proof that its worldview was correct all along. The organization does not just describe or comment on the event. It tries to impose the lens through which these events should be understood. And it also tries, what's very important, to draw the new boundaries, to push the border of orthodoxy inside the jihadist field itself. Because ISIS frames any hesitation, ambiguity, or strategic flexibility regarding the current conflict as evident of doctrinal weakness. So the war has become useful for ISIS in several ways simultaneously. It reinforces internal cohesion. It strengthens its claim to ideological consistency, and it allows the group, also the organization, to present itself as the uncompromising defender of orthodoxy within global jihadism. That, of course, does not necessarily mean that ISIS gains operationally from the conflict in the short term. That would be too simplistic to say. But communicatively, the organization clearly sees or has seen an opportunity to sharpen distinctions and capitalize on polarization. Al-Qaeda's position, on the other hand, sorry, um, as what can be described as uncomfortable, far more uncomfortable. Because ISIS reacts through escalation, but Al Qaeda reacts largely through silence. And honestly, I mean, that silence is difficult to ignore once you start tracking the material systematically. In these few months following the escalation, Iran has disappeared from all Al-Qaeda official propaganda output. And when I mean disappear, like totally disappear. The conflict itself um, receives remarkably little attention considering its regional significance. And I'm not talking just Ashab, yani Al-Qaeda Central, also its branches. And somehow, I mean, when broader references emerge, they generally remained, within this familiar framework of the Crusaders, Zionist alliance, without really placing Iran nowhere under focus. And let me put it clear, I mean, this silence is not accidental. It reflects constraints. And this is where the idea of the stress test that gives title to the second document becomes analytically useful because the current situation exposes tensions that have existed within Al Qaeda for years, but that somehow were easier to manage under less visible, less exposed conditions. Like ideologically, Salafi jihadism has always treated Shiism as problematic to say the least. But operationally, Al Qaeda's relationship with Iran has long been like more complicated than its rhetoric would normally suggest. You we'll definitely touch upon this in bigger detail later, but senior figures of Al Qaeda, including its current alleged emir, Saif al-Adl, have spent like extended periods connected directly or indirectly to Iran as a territory, like under varying forms of restriction, tolerance, supervision. It's quite complicated. That obviously does not mean that Al Qaeda is somehow aligned with Iran in any conventional sense. Now, I want to be clear about that. I mean, the relationship is much more, how can I define, like transactional, limited, opaque, and definitely shaped by mutual utility rather than by genuine strategic convergence of their objectives. But under current conditions, maintaining this ambiguity becomes harder. This is one of the central findings of the report. Like crises like these increase the costs of ambiguity inside the jihadist ecosystem. What might previously have remained confined to ideological scholarly debates within jihadist circles suddenly becomes visible to broader audiences. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, ISIS understands these very, very well. In many ways, it is attempting to transform the treatment of Iran into like a legitimacy test for doctrinal credibility inside global jihadism. Now, whether the strategy proves effective in the long term is definitely a different question. Because if the region has demonstrated anything over the past 2 decades, it is that survival does not always reward exactly the most ideologically rigid actors. Like in many environments, adaptability, as I mentioned at the beginning, and flexibility matter just as much as doctrinal consistency, sometimes like even more. And this is precisely why the current movement is so interesting analytically. In my humble opinion, what we're witnessing here is part of the intra-jihadist competition over how global jihadism should position itself moving forward. How rigid should it remain? How politically adaptable it can become? Or how can these organizations balance like ideological purity against operational survival at the same time remaining appealing to the basis? See, it's really a complex a turning point actually. And Of course, I mean, I think that broader state dimensions become especially important when we start examining Iran's own strategic calculations regarding Sunni jihadist actors, particularly al-Qaeda, and how relationships that appear contradictory, or at least ideologically contradictory, can, like, nevertheless persist under the right conditions. So, with that, I mean, I think Dr. Harmosh, Dr. Sarah Harmosh, is perfectly positioned to take us deeper into that dimension of the discussion, particularly the Saif al-Adil question, Iran's strategic logic, and maybe also the broader implications of these dynamics.
Thank you so much, Sergio, for this great introduction and for all the findings from the reports that you mentioned. These are very interesting and very timely findings, especially in the current war today. But yes, the Saif al-Adli question has been on everybody's mind since the Iran war started. And it's interesting because after I've been delving deeper and deeper into him and his writing and his situation, I've gotten and published a piece on him, and how Al-Qaeda would look under him. I've gotten so many DMs on Twitter asking me if I know where he is in Iran right now. And I'm like, no, I absolutely do not know where he exactly is currently right now. But yes, it is definitely an interesting question. But, for years, I think the analysis of Iran and Al-Qaeda ties have been shaped by the assumption that sectarian hostility precludes meaningful cooperation. And I think today, not just with the current Iran war, I think with post October 7th attacks, that assumption is becoming very much less useful. And I know the West and a lot of Western experts have used and cannot sometimes grasp the Shia Sunni divide, and the Shia Sunni divide becomes this big label that experts and Western policymakers can't see beyond, and then they won't be able to accept the fact that like some of these groups do engage in meaningful cooperation and ally based on transactional or strategic priorities that they have beyond the sectarian notion of it. But today, I think the more relevant question is not whether Tehran and Al Qaeda share an ideology, but whether they share strategic incentives. And increasingly, the answer appears to be yes. And as you mentioned, at the center of this relationship between Al Qaeda and Iran is Saif al Adil, who is way more pragmatic, way more less ideologically and doctrinally rigid than his predecessors. And he's the first military and intelligence officer from uh, on the Al Qaeda leadership front. And his potential leadership is making changes within the relationship between Al Qaeda and Iran, and even between Al Qaeda and Iran's proxies. We've seen since 2022, since the U.S. has killed Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al Qaeda in Yemen has stopped attacking the Houthis and started tactically cooperating with them. And many analysts and experts were like, oh, it's interesting. Why did the attack stop in 2022? The Houthis and Al Qaeda in Yemen have not attacked each other. And the answer is, well, Saif al-Adil became the new leader and started to shift these dynamics and started to see value in more cooperating than attacking the groups. So since he assumed command, Al Qaeda and Yemen halted attacks on the Houthis and began cooperating with the Iranian proxy. And Al Adil also around the post October 7th attacks started the propaganda and the messaging of the group started to align with Iran's messaging. So I think the question is no longer whether these ties exist. They clearly do, and much more than they did before. But it's whether the current war is transforming it into a more usable instrument of Iranian statecraft. And if so, I think Al Qaeda's value lies not only at what it can do directly, but in the reach and geographic flexibility it provides at a moment when Iran's more visible proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, well, Hamas and Hezbollah are under strain and the Houthis have been more contained. And I think, looking back, this is not very uncommon for Iran. Iran's formed unlikely alliances and unlikely cooperation with other Sunni actors like Hamas. And I think it can replicate that model with Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda, similar to Hamas, is a Sunni jihadist group. So, and previously in the 1990s, Iran did support Al Qaeda, whether providing it with logistical aid, safe havens, and at times training. And the linchpin in this relationship was Mustafa Hamid. He was a senior al-Qaeda associate, and he is the father-in-law to al-Adl, who would today rise as the al-Qaeda presumed de facto leader. And his father-in-law, Mustafa Hamid, similar to Saif al-Adl, has emphasized effective jihad strategy over doctrinal rigidity. And he deepened those ties between al-Qaeda and Iran. And following in Hamid's footsteps, al-Adl also strengthened these connections back in the 1990s. And he organized meetings and training sessions in Sudan and Lebanon, which brought together some of the most notorious names in terrorism: Osama bin Laden, Hamas's Ahmad Yassin, and Hezbollah's Imad Maghniya. So during these times and these gatherings, Nasser al-Bahri, who was the former bin Laden bodyguard, had written a memoir, and he recounts bin Laden's outlook on Tehran, and he explained that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this is exactly where Saif al-Adl is operationalizing that exact notion. And to just look at when Iran is also very strategic and has thought about this for long term. If you look back at the after the 9/11 attacks, Iran's connections with al-Qaeda evolved rather than disappeared. Tehran became a destination for senior al-Qaeda figures fleeing Afghanistan, including Saif al-Adl, and Iran was providing logistics, funding, and strategic plannings. And what's interesting is Iran did not treat all the senior al-Qaeda figures who went into Iran the same way. They detained some al-Qaeda figures and allowed others, like Saif al-Adl, as George Tenet noted, under loose form of house arrest in Iran. And then where they repatriated and returned extradited figures like Nasser al-Wuhaishi, who was killed in Yemen, they retained others like Saif al-Adl, who they deemed more strategically valuable. They saw that Saif al-Adl could rise as an al-Qaeda leader in the future, and they saw potential in grooming him and strengthening the relationship with him specifically in order to later on be of a strategic value and of benefit to Iran itself. And however, to note, because when we always talk about Iran al-Qaeda, we have to talk about Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, and we have to talk about the 2003 Iraq War. When during that time in 2003, when Iran was backing Iraqi Shia militia, they also supported Sunni factions. Notably, Nasser al-Bahri's memoir discusses how Iran facilitated al-Qaeda's Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi's entry into Iraq. They were aiming at destabilizing their adversaries and integrating al-Qaeda more into their broader strategies. But as we all know, Zarqawi's brutal anti-Shiite campaign clashed with Iran's goal. And while bin Laden initially endorsed Zarqawi's harsh tactics and recognized him as an al-Qaeda leader, he eventually saw that Zarqawi worsened the situation and weakened the already fragile partnership they both had. And in response to both bin Laden and Zawahiri and then Zarqawi's actions in Iran, against Iran, Iran moved from cooperation to coercion. We saw around that time, Tehran started cracking down on al-Qaeda members within its borders. And also, they detained members of bin Laden's family to leverage these arrests to exert control and push for a cessation on attacks on the Shia. And interestingly, in 2007, bin Laden explained that Iran started to serve as a key conduit for financing personal movement and communication. And also Zawahiri later that year in 2008, he acknowledged Iranian support that enhanced the group's capabilities in theaters such as Yemen, further illustrating how the operational links and ties were developing. And what's most interesting in looking at the Iran al-Qaeda relationship is the Syria case, the Syria example, where over there, Iran started to use al-Qaeda more as a tool rather than just an ally. Iran deployed al-Qaeda linked operatives from its territory into Syria via the Quds Force, where they wanted them to counter the Islamic State and then support their Syrian ally. Iran deployed Abu Khair al-Masri and Abu Muhammad al-Masri, both who had influential roles within the al-Qaeda senior leadership. Their presence did contribute to efforts to shape the militant landscape, including alignments and exacerbation of divisions among rival factions. So we saw this directly. And then by 2018, the United Nations reporting indicated that al-Qaeda Iran's based leadership was exercising more direct influence over activities in Syria. And We've also seen U.S. Treasury Department and other U.S. organizations who have sanctioned elements within the Iran Ministry of Intelligence and Security who have been supporting al-Qaeda linked networks, whether it's in Pakistan or Iraq. So, especially today, even after Saif al-Adil took the helm of the al-Qaeda leadership, he was very close with Qasem Soleimani. And he has written, Saif al-Adil has written something to Iran in his own writing and said, "We are not enemies, you are our partners in changing the world," which shows you the pragmatism that consistently reflected Al Qaeda's, like Saif al-Adl's thinking, and now Al Qaeda's its own operationalization of these like methods. And then even when Al Qaeda negotiated his 2015 release from Iran, Al Adel either chose to stay or was compelled to remain. But in 2016, he was managing proxy conflicts across the Middle East, aligning with Iran's destabilizing efforts. We've also seen in 2022 the cooperation between Al Qaeda in Yemen and the Houthis in Yemen. Not only that, we've also seen cooperation between the Houthis in Yemen and then Al-Shabaab in Somalia. As recent as the February 2026 UN monitoring report, the Houthis have paid even AQAP 75 or $65,000 for an attack they carried out on their behalf. So we've seen in not only the al-Qaeda messaging shift against Iran, but we've also seen Iran's proxies cooperating with al-Qaeda affiliates in different theaters. And they see the value in that cooperation. I mean, during the 1990s, Hezbollah provided training for al-Qaeda in the south of Lebanon. And after that, we've seen al-Qaeda conduct suicide attacks, which led again to the 1998 US embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. And then today we're seeing AQAP cooperate with the Houthis on drone attacks, and which has been increasing their sophistication and their financial revenues. So a lot of things have been changing, especially the October 7th and after the October 7th attacks and within the current war. We're seeing al-Qaeda and Iran align more on the common enemies. Israel and the US and the West are front and center in those. We've seen also the differences in the cooperation between Iranian proxies and Al-Qaeda. And yes, I mean, we've also seen a new operational dynamic domain with the cyber. We've seen a cyber jihadist movement group pledge allegiance to Al-Qaeda. And after that, we've seen the cyber jihadist movement cooperate with IRGC cyber apparatus on coordinated attacks against US and the West and US and Western interests. So we've seen all of these new developments, and I think the problem remains that Washington and a lot of Western experts and policymakers do not seem to fully grasp the implications of the Iran and Al-Qaeda partnership. These groups, again, like you said, Sergio, they're not in a traditional alliance in the sense of an alliance. But right now, they see greater value in cooperating against the common enemy. And then later on, and probably many, many years to follow, they'll go back to fighting each other. But currently, right now, this Shia and Sunni cooperation tactically poses greater threats than we are realizing. They're cooperating in so many different domains. Being united is going to cause the West more issues than anything else. And I think the U.S. foreign policy and Western foreign policy continues to underestimate Iran's ability to form partnership based on necessity and not religious ideals. Because again, for Al-Qaeda and Iran, the ends always have justified the means. And I think we need to understand that in geopolitics, pragmatism has always tends to prevail over ideology. I mean, similar to what you said, adaptability and flexibility matter so much more than doctrinal rigidity. And with that, I think I'll kick it off back to you and then or to Colin to build off and continue on those points.
Amazing. I mean, thank you very much, Sarah, for such a nuanced, detailed, insightful intervention. I mean, particularly for helping us unpack a bit the strategic logic underpinning Iran's relationship with the Sunni jihadist actors, especially Al-Qaeda, and Yeah, and the broader regional implications surrounding figures such as Saif al-Adl. Uh, Let me just a quick reminder that the Q&A session that will follow uh, needs from your input. So please, I am sure you have many questions, or at least that's my case. So send them all the way, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. And yeah, thank you once again, Sarah. I think that what you explain actually provides the perfect bridge to bringing Mr. Colin Smith, whose perspective will definitely allow us to move from the doctrinal and geopolitical dimensions to some of the implications of the current conflict and what all these might mean for the future trajectory of both al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, of those global jihadist organizations and their global network. Mr. Smith, thank you
Uh,
very much.
thank, Thank you very much. You've set me up there with a huge task to try and answer those questions. And I have to say, there are two very good presentations there, set the bar really high. I'm not sure if I'm going to get in, I'm going to limbo dance beneath that bar, I think. So my name's Colin. I'm the coordinator of the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, working to the Security Council. We look at al-Qaeda, Daesh, and their affiliate groups, and we write reports every 6 months on the trajectory of the threat. One of the things that makes us different to any other part of the Security Council, or part of the UN, I should say, is that we have an explicit mandate to engage with intelligence agencies around the world. So the way that we work is we engage with agencies, we pick their brains about what they think the main issues are, what they think the main threats are. And the unclassified part of that is what forms the report. And the issues we're talking about today are ones that are front and center on the minds of most agencies we're talking to. Over the past couple of weeks, I think I've spoken to 15 to 20 agencies, and I've asked them this explicit question about what is the impact of the Iran conflict on al-Qaeda and on Daesh trajectory of the threat. And you might think that because we're engaging with agencies, we have a particular insight into what's going on, and you'd be sadly mistaken. Because most agencies, frankly, are grappling with the same questions. Frankly, they don't have the same kind of answers, the detailed answers. They're in the same position that we are to try and make sense of what the conflict actually means for the trajectory of the threat. The information picture that they have, that we have, is fragmented. At times, it's contradictory. There is no single version of the truth when it comes to these issues. And that's exacerbated by the nature of the organizations we're looking at. Because although we all have, organograms of al-Qaeda and Daesh, and we look at who's head of external operations or who's head of finance and so on, and those organograms are useful, but these organizations do not work in the way that Western organizations might work. They're not clear structures with clear lines of control. Now, that they're hierarchical, but they don't have that kind of organogram-based structure. Charitably, I might say that they're adaptable, that they're fluid, they're decentralized. If I was less charitable, I'd say, frankly, they're a bit chaotic. At times, they can resemble a student union. Lots of voices, everyone clamoring to be heard, but actually decisions are taken by small cliques of individuals who might have cultural ties or familial ties or have personal relationships. So the way the organizations work is important when you consider about how they can take advantage of the current situation. And it's exacerbated if you look at the leadership. So Sarah mentioned this. If you look at Daesh, fourth leader, I think, in 5 years. Life expectancy of a Daesh leader is not very good. We don't know with certainty who the current so-called Khalif is of Daesh, though many people say, or some people say it's Abdul Qadir Mumin. But Daesh supporters are a bit fed up because they're not really hearing from the leader. They're not seeing him. They don't know what he thinks. They don't know what he believes. And there is a sense of dissatisfaction with the leadership. And if you look at al-Qaeda, as Sarah said, as well as Sergio mentioned, Zawahiri died in 2022, yet al-Qaeda has still not formally acknowledged his death. So we refer to the de facto leader, Saif al-Adil. But there are a number of challenges for Saif, not least in terms of his location. Is there confidence in him as a leader? We've heard about dissent, dissatisfaction with his leadership, that his propaganda output, he's kind of shouting into the void. Nobody's really listening to what he's saying. And we've heard about different balances of power within AQ itself. So Ibrahim al-Khozi is sometimes described to us as being the ideological leader of al-Qaeda, whereas Saif is more the military leader. And you can debate that. I mean, it's you can discuss it. Others have said that Saif is that al-Khozi is essentially the key advisor to Saif. He's the one that Saif listens to when he makes his decision. Either way, it's a confused picture. And if I was an al-Qaeda supporter, I'd be confused. I wouldn't really know where the leadership was or what they believed or what the direction of travel was. So it's not surprising when we try and understand what al-Qaeda and Daesh are thinking on the Iran conflict. There isn't a single picture. It is fragmentary. There are different views, there are different thoughts, there are different opinions. So it's very hard to dig into exactly what they're thinking, exactly how they will try and exploit the current situation. And if you then look at communications, the communications around the Iran conflict have been, well, flat-footed, at best, and in some ways they've actually been disrupted. So if I look at al-Qaeda, As-Sahab Media, 5th of February, they put out a statement saying there's a build-up of forces in the Gulf. We should take on those Crusader armies. But it went down quite badly. I mean, al-Qaeda supporters saw it as being implicit support for the Iranian government. It wasn't the kind of the message that actually resonated with supporters, didn't really mobilize people to action. And we heard about cyber jihad movement. It kind of responded. A new group said it had established itself as Beit al-Maqdis, so you can debate whether it's actually a group or not. But there wasn't that response from the AQ supporters and followers that you might expect when As-Sahab Media puts out a statement like that. And Sergio, as you said, after that statement, there's been very little. They've not been very vocal. They've not put much out. They've not really said what they think about the Iran conflict. In fact, in some ways, it might suggest about their communications being disrupted, because at the end of April, they put out a statement talking about Pakistan and Afghanistan and TTP. But although the statement was published at the end of April, it was written and signed at the end of March. And you have to ask, why? Why was there a month gap between agreeing the statement and actually publishing it? And it has to raise the question, have their communications been disrupted by the Iran conflict? And the question about where Saif al-Adil is, how he can communicate with his colleagues, I mean, that would suggest there may be a degree of disruption in the communication network. And it's certainly something that we're interested in to see how things might have changed as a result of the conflict. And if you look at Daesh, so the Daesh spokesperson put out his first statement for nearly 2 years towards the end of February. I think it's 23rd of February. Al-Ansari put out his big statement, 2 years in the making. Didn't mention Iran. Didn't mention any build-up of forces. Didn't really mention anything. It was flat-footed response to what was going on in the region. Everyone else was talking about the build-up of forces. Everyone else was talking about potential conflict in Iran or in and around Iran. The Daesh spokesperson didn't, in his big statement, didn't even mention it. And that again has to raise the question about, well, why didn't he? Why did he put that statement out then? Why didn't it mention the most pressing issue of the time? And that's a question also in terms of disruption of communications. Was the communication disrupted? Did he write it ages in advance and it was only published at the beginning of Ramadan? But it's an interesting illustration, I think, of how Daesh is not always that fleet of foot. And sometimes they can be quite flat-footed. They then try to catch up with things. They've then tried to put out media at the end of February, beginning of March, to try and catch up and to try and get control of the narrative. And their statements essentially have had 3 key elements. The first one has been, when your enemy's fighting your enemy, don't get in the way. Why should you? So keep your heads down in this conflict. It's not really in our interests. Let the US and Iran fight. That's fine by us. And the second thing they've said is al-Qaeda. Look at their statements. They've clearly sold out. They don't represent the movement any longer. Only we represent the movement. You should be coming to us. AQ supporters, forget them. Come to us. We're the true voice. And the third element has been, Sergio, as I think you mentioned, Sarah kind of picked up on it too, has been to emphasize sectarianism. So the statement, I think, on the 5th of March in Al-Naba said the primary target is Shiite communities. And that's what we should be focusing on, even over and above Jewish communities and other communities. It's not the first time they've said it. They have a long history of trying to provoke sectarian strife. But it's interesting they've said it so clearly and so loudly at this precise time. So this point about sectarianism is one that will be interesting to see how it plays out over the coming weeks and months. And I agree very much with what people have said about al-Qaeda, that al-Qaeda is much more fluid when it comes to sectarian divides. It is much happier about working across the divides. But for Daesh, it's been much more of a principle for them to emphasize the division and to try and exploit those so-called divisions between Shiism and Sunnism. Now, in terms of practical implications of all this, we won't know for a while because, frankly, it takes quite a long time to plan an operation and to execute it. Unless you're looking at an inspired attack, if you're looking at a directed attack, it will likely take months for something to come to fruition. So we won't see, or even longer, so we won't see the practical implications of any policy shifts for quite a while. But I think there are a number of areas that it's worth looking at. The first one is the implications in terms of the threat in Iran itself. So Jaish al-Adl, with its apparent links to al-Qaeda, has been carrying out attacks in Iran for a number of years. In December, it announced it was forming or joining an umbrella movement, the People's Fighters Front, or JMM, which was dedicated to the Baluch movement, to Baluch independence. There are a number of groups already active in that area. Baluch Liberation Army, for example, been carrying out a number of attacks in Pakistan. We're looking now at Jaish al-Adl, JMM, looking to increase its activity in parts of Iran. If the Iranian security services or security forces are distracted, potentially gives Jaish al-Adl, JMM, opportunity to exploit the situation in parts of Iran. And that's something that we're looking at or we're wondering about. The second kind of practical implication, I suppose, is concerning security in some Gulf countries. And they've expressed concern to us, or they've raised the issue of their security forces being diverted or deflected onto Shia militia movements in their countries. Do they have sufficient resource to cover both the Shia militia and also the threat from al-Qaeda and Daesh, or will they have to divert resources from one to the other? And that potentially could create an opening or an opportunity for groups such as Daesh to try and take advantage of distracted local security forces. Now, the Gulf countries themselves are confident that they can walk and chew gum at the same time. But again, it's something that we're alive to and we're thinking about in the context of the evolution of the threat. And then when we look at the implications for al-Qaeda and Daesh, we are unlikely to see centrally directed activity, but we are likely to see some kind of activity or attempts to exploit the situation through their affiliates. So with Daesh, ISIL Khorasan, ISKP, has already carried out a number of attacks in Iran. The Kerman attack in 2024 killed, I think, 69 people, injured double that number. There have been reports of further plots by ISKP in Iran, disrupted plots. ISKP is undoubtedly suppressed, but it is not eliminated. It has shown it can still carry out high-profile attacks, and I would say that the attack in the Shia mosque in Islamabad at the beginning of February was probably ISKP. I know it was claimed by a so-called new group, ISIL in Pakistan, but the likelihood is that's a chapter of ISKP rather than a separate entity. So they've carried out attacks against Shia in Islamabad. Their commitment to the cause and potentially to trying to provoke further Shia or sectarian strife seems unabated. And the risk from Daesh and ISKP posing a threat in some form or trying to exploit the situation seems relatively high. And then on al-Qaeda, Sarah's mentioned it already, AQAP, AQ in the Arabian Peninsula. There have been established links between the Houthi and AQAP. We've reported on that previously. In fact, AQAP felt the need to put out a press statement criticizing one of our reports because we talked about the links between the Houthi and AQAP. Those links seem to be getting stronger, relatively opportunistic, but getting stronger. We've had reports of weapons transfers between the two. There does seem to have been some kind of truce for the past few years, as Sarah mentioned, between the Houthi and AQAP. We also have strengthening links between al-Shabaab and the Houthi. So reports that al-Shabaab fighters have been trained by the Houthi and there's been weapons transfers between them. And as well as strengthening links between al-Shabaab and AQAP itself. So financial transfers and again, weapons transfers. So in terms of external operations and in terms of those groups that might try and pose a threat in terms of external operations, AQAP, I think, has to be top of the list. It has the intent, it has the capability, it seems to have the operating space. And given events in and around Iran, it might have more impetus, more motivation to demonstrate the continuing relevance of al-Qaeda on the global stage. So in terms of the threats that we're seeing and the threats that individual states are talking to us about, I think I would put AQAP at the very top of the agenda as the group that wanted to try and exploit the situation and make the most of it. So I think my three kind of conclusions are about the organogram of the groups doesn't represent the power structure of the groups. The communications have been flat-footed and potentially disrupted, but individual affiliate groups will look for opportunities to try and exploit the situation and do what they can to burnish their credentials. I hope that helps. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for such an insightful presentations. We do really agree on many of those conclusions, and I think with being having a look at very accurate data, both historically and recent, the three of us, which really made for a great set of three presentations. Again, thank you very much, Mr. Smith. As I mentioned a bit earlier, we're now opening the Q&A session. While questions from the audience start coming in, I would like to ask myself a question to each of our speakers, if you allow me, and I'll well, let me try to beg you to be concise, because I mean to leave room for more questions from the audience, because these are questions that I'm sure we could discuss for hours, really. So to Dr. Hermouche, I would ask that well, one of the things that our research suggests is that ISIS is trying to weaponize clarity, while Al-Qaeda continues to operate through this ambiguity and strategic flexibility. But in your view, which model or which approach could the current conditions reward somehow? Or to put it differently, do you think Al-Qaeda's, given your approach, Al-Qaeda's current communication stance risks really undermining its appeal?
I think this is a great question. I think it goes along with what you mentioned earlier, Sergio, on the silence of Al-Qaeda and how it is deliberate. And I agree with you, it is deliberate. Al-Qaeda is very strategic, and I think the approach that they're following right now is on purpose, because they're first with Taliban taking with the Taliban takeover in 2021, and trying to seek international legitimacy. Al-Qaeda has been trying to keep eyes off of Afghanistan and off of its own its own movements and actions and things that they're doing over there, which is why, as Colin mentioned, there's been this interesting autonomy and differentiation between Al-Qaeda core and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, and as their recent work has shown. So Al-Qaeda doesn't, ISIS recruits from the younger generation. ISIS recruits a lot of people. They don't do the same vetting process as Al-Qaeda does. So Al-Qaeda doesn't seem to care as much about recruiting. Yes, Saif al-Adil put out this whole like call for foreign fighters back in July 2024, which, got like, as Colin mentioned, screaming into the void because it was not answered. But then as of a couple of days ago, Al-Qaeda put out their Yemen branch put out a video inciting and calling for lone wolf attacks and calling for jihadists and for individuals to conduct attacks from where they are because it's better than coming and doing hijra. It's more costly, and then it would be more beneficial if they were to conduct it where they are rather than traveling. So Al-Qaeda seems to still be very like selective on who they recruit. It still carries 9/11 veterans. It still has those senior people like Ibrahim al-Qussi, like Saif al-Adil, like al-Ghamdi, and like other senior leaders from the 9/11 and the Bin Laden era. So they are more selective, they are more deliberate, and their appeal, I don't think they care so much about recruiting as many people. They're focusing, from what I'm seeing from Saif al-Adil's point of view and his own book and his own words, they care more about quality than quantity. And that tells you, like, if you have a smaller but greater force that's well trained, that's flexible, that's adaptable, you can still achieve a lot more than just recruiting by numbers. Because as we've seen with Al-Qaeda, numbers don't really matter. It's the ambiguity, it's the strategic flexibility, it's the creativity of that movement versus ISIS is more just kind of like laissez-faire approach where yes, they let in more people, they are focusing more on making more noise than Al-Qaeda has, but also we've seen over the past years they were like fast and quick at taking territory and establishing an Islamic State, only for it to a couple of years later to fall down. And Al-Qaeda has written about this, have written about how they skipped the steps that Al-Qaeda has already had, and they were not patient enough to be able to maintain that territory. So I do think the Al-Qaeda approach might definitely be the winning approach for Al-Qaeda versus what ISIS has been doing. However, as you mentioned, these organizations learn from each other and adapt from like tactics and strategies and things from each other. So we might be seeing, we start to see as Al-Qaeda started to adapt a more institutionalized approach to its leadership, from taking it from ISIS, we might start to see the different approaches start to overlap or be executed by those organizations at the same time.
Thank you very much for such a detailed answer. And my question to you, Mr. Smith, is I know you've dealt with it during your presentation, but from a monitoring perspective, when you look at regional branches and particularly referring to AQAP and the Islamic State Khorasan, given the presence of Shia Muslims within their immediate reach, do you get the sense that the narrative opportunities created by the current crisis are translating into meaningful operational opportunities, or are those two dimensions becoming like increasingly disconnected?
I think it's too soon to say, actually, whether there's been any kind of implication or any change on the ground. As I mentioned, there was the assassination of the Shia cleric in Damascus by the Sayyida Zainab Mosque a week or so ago, and that's kind of interesting. Some kind of potentially attempted provoking sectarian divisions within Syria itself, and we've heard about that for a while. In terms of whether the conflict in and around Iran is an impetus for that, I think it's far too soon to say, because most of the attack plots have quite long lead times, at least the significant ones. So if you're looking at a directed attack, it can take months or even years for a proper attack, for a kind of large-scale spectacular attack to be planned. So we're not going to see any immediate implications from the Iran conflict, I think, for quite a while. We may see smaller scale attacks, or we may, well, there's a risk, I guess, that we look back on previous attacks and we look at it through this particular prism and perspective, and we see trends which perhaps aren't there. So I mentioned the attack on the Shia mosque in Islamabad, but that actually predates this. That was the beginning of February. And there have been other sectarian attacks for a while, but I mean, it's whether we are seeing a trend or difference, an increased incidence of sectarian type attacks, and it's too soon to be able to draw any firm conclusions on that, I think.
Okay, let's go with some of those questions from the audience. I'll try uh, to provide you with one and one each other, so we can like better divide and conquer, split and conquer. So first question for Dr. Ramosh. We have Yvette here who says, why would Saif al-Adel be in Iran where Mossad, CIA, or the MI6 run networks? Wouldn't he be safer in Afghanistan, where he trained Taliban fighters prior to 9/11, etc., etc.?
Yeah, that is a great question. Again, it goes along with how many DMs I've gotten about if I knew where he is or the exact location he's in. It's I think it's difficult for Saif al-Adil to be in Afghanistan right now because Taliban is trying to get international recognition, and it would jeopardize, it would put all eyes back in on Afghanistan, and it would make Taliban's not so established and foundational argument that al-Qaeda does not exist there and there's no al-Qaeda leadership there. It would make that argument even harder to dispute or to dismiss, especially if someone who is as senior as Saif al-Adil is there. So I do still think right now with like Iran is a safer choice for him because of all the different dynamics within Taliban and Taliban recognition and the Taliban al-Qaeda relationship, but also with the war. I mean, he used to be in like he is still in Iran. We don't know where he exactly is. With the current war, it's even more difficult to move from where he is into Afghanistan, and I think that would complicate a lot of different things. And he's established a good relationship with the Iranians, with the IRGC. And the IRGC or Iran might also like think of him as a leverage to use. So there are pros and cons for Saif al-Adil being there, especially as Colin mentioned, the different dissatisfaction and dynamics between the tension that was caused between different Al-Qaeda affiliates and Al-Qaeda core because of his presence in Iran, and which could be also one of the reasons why Al-Qaeda has not announced his leadership or even acknowledged the death of Ayman al-Zawahiri at this point. So it is both countries provide pros and cons for Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda Taliban, but it's strategically beneficial for Saif al-Adil right now in order to protect Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's Taliban relationship in Afghanistan. I think Colin can elaborate more on that for his points.
I mean, just very briefly. I mean, so Afghanistan wasn't very safe for Zawahiri. I mean, Zawahiri in a Haqqani safe house, taken out in 2022. So it's not really a safe area for him. And as Sarah said, the Taliban, I would be surprised if they really want him, given what's going on, and given the political costs to them of being seen to have him on their territory. There was open source reporting at the end of January, beginning of February, that Saif was looking to travel to Afghanistan. There wasn't confirmed reporting, but it seemed reasonably credible. And this reporting said that the Taliban had turned around and said, no, we don't want you in here. It's fine, you can go somewhere else, but don't come to Afghanistan because you're too much of a problem for us. So I understand where the question comes from, but I don't think Afghanistan is a particularly good option for him at the moment. And there are other options, there are other alternatives. I think the question is how easily he can travel.
Okay. Let me provide you with a question that also suits you perfectly, Colin. Khalid al-Saddah says there is growing coordination among the Houthis, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and al-Shabaab in Somalia. These groups remain strategic threats to Yemen, the region, and the international community. But do you still believe the international community still regards them as critical threats?
Yes. I mean, it's a simple answer. I mean, in 2024, AQAP was running out of money, couldn't even pay its fighters, and it was literally turning away recruits because it couldn't afford to pay for them. But in the course of 2025, partly because of the injections it seems to be getting from al-Shabaab, it's regularized its financial situation. It now has much better ability to operate. It seems to have better access to weapons. AQAP has pretty much always been the vanguard of the AQ movement. It's always been the affiliate that was most well equipped and most eager to carry out external operations. And some of those external operations were extremely sophisticated. So when I was working back in the UK, one of the issues I dealt with, showing my age, was the printer plot, the printer cartridge plot by AQAP back in 2010, 2011. I mean, it's a very sophisticated plot. Some of that know-how remained. The bomb maker himself doesn't, though they are still circulating his articles in Inspire Guide 11, I think it was, or perhaps 12. There was an article by al-Suri carried in the guide. They definitely pose a threat. And if I look at our last report that we published in February, I wonder whether we got it right when we said the threat was opportunistic from AQAP, because I do wonder whether, in fact, we're seeing something that might be more significant. And one issue that causes us some concern is the fact that AQAP has been very quiet recently. It's not been pumping out propaganda. It's not been as active as it has been previously. Now, that might be because it's consolidating, or it might be a precursor to something else. So we're watching it quite carefully.
No, and I completely, to add to Colin's point, I completely agree. And yes, I mean, I think from the US and the West, I think there's been a lot of focus on AQAP specifically. And as recent the UN report, yes, their financials are increasing. But as you mentioned, Colin, they were pushing out so much propaganda throughout 2024 and then 2025, and suddenly this year it has not been as much as it used to be before. Which yes, begs the question: is it consolidation, or is it preparation for a specific attack? Because as you mentioned, AQAP is now handling the international attacks portfolio from al-Qaeda, and I've seen that throughout the propaganda that AQAP is taking a more center and front role in those aspects. So hopefully nothing happens, but yes, it is good to just keep an eye on those dynamics and see what will unfold.
Okay, there's one for you, Sarah. This introduces a new and I think interesting variable. Uh, there's a user, Mahmoud Godra al-Nakrih or something like that. No disrespect meant. That says, how could Iran use the Muslim Brotherhood, if so, as an ally or a proxy? Remember that the MB, the Muslim Brotherhood, is a hotbed of Hamas, al-Qaeda, etc. Could this be a possibility? I think I didn't frame the question quite correctly.
It's an interesting question for sure. I mean, it's not the Muslim Brotherhood angle to Iran is not as prevalent or as much discussed as Al-Qaeda's angle to Iran or other groups. But yes, as the he mentioned that the ideology goes down to the Muslim Brotherhood, but also we have to like realize and acknowledge that the Muslim Brotherhood also has different affiliations and branches all over the world that are actually politically embedded right now, not just designated as whether terrorist organizations. And the US has taken a more focused approach on the Muslim Brotherhood lately, and especially in this current administration. So, is there a possibility for them to be used? It's I think it's unlikely. I think the ideology runs very, yes, similar. I think the hotbed of it is all. I think there are definitely some linkages still between the groups and between the funding and logistics and the pipelines, but I wouldn't see them as an actual direct proxy that Iran would use. And I think it would create more concerns for the Gulf countries and for other regions on that. And it would put a lot of focus on the Muslim Brotherhood, which I don't think they are looking into that. I could see, again, as we've discussed here, a more of Iran has deployed Al-Qaeda individuals into Syria. So Iran has used Al-Qaeda fighters and Al-Qaeda as a tool, as a potential proxy. But again, it would be difficult for me to see right now, I guess, the more direct Muslim Brotherhood Iran proxy relationship.
No, definitely. I share your opinion. Another question for you, Colin. Uh, it's an anonymous. So, the last United Nations Security Council report stated that AQAP leader quote, reinforce the group's autonomy from AQ central leadership. Has this changed since the start of the Iran war? And does this mean that AQAP and Al-Qaeda Central have become closer or IQAP more autonomous?
I don't think the kind of relationship has changed significantly as a result of the conflict in and around Iran. I mean, I think AQAP, as I said, is seen as the vanguard of the AQ movement. It is where the activity happens, where the action happens. I mean, the relationship between al-Houthi and Saif al-Adil is an interesting one, and is one that we would like to understand, I think, a bit better and a bit more detail than we do at the moment. It's because it's this issue about whether al-Houthi is actually almost like the ideological leader, and Saif is the kind of practical, pragmatic leader. And it gets back to the point I made at the very beginning that there's always a risk of or danger when we look at these organizations as if they are formal organizations in our sense of the words. They're like they have a kind of formal structure and power flows according to that formal structure, because they're much more fluid than that. And I think also when we look at some of these organizations or the affiliates even, I do wonder whether we need to understand better than we do some of the kind of the contours within them. So I'm thinking in particular about ISKP, ISIL-K. I know that's not quite the question, but because we do see differences between the Uzbek contingent in ISKP and the Tajik contingent and the Pashtun-speaking contingent. And they're not just differences of policy, they're differences of approach, they're differences in terms of use of new tech and how, use of AI and so on. So the contours within the organization, I think, are quite important to understand when we're looking at them. Same is true with AQAP. People often talk about tribal alliances within AQAP and how that kind of straddles the organization, it goes beyond, which is a very valid point, and how there are intermarriages with which have been encouraged for the AQAP leaders, for the followers to marry into the tribes. It changes dynamics quite considerably, and I think we need to understand some of those dynamics when we try and understand the organization better. Fundamentally, is AQAP a threat? Does it pose a threat? Absolutely. I'm sure Sarah wants to add anything on that.
No, I think I do definitely agree with you on that. I think AQAP has always been the vanguard of like the entire movement. I think Al-Qaeda core AQAP isn't even looking. I have an article hopefully coming out soon on the uh, out- outdated question, but on why Al-Qaeda's affiliates did not join ISIS when ISIS would speak, because it was a better alternative during the peak of ISIS. And examining those different relationships between the different affiliates showed that, like, after testing it, AQAP had always had the closer relationship with Al Qaeda Central. And it's because all of its leaders have been very close to bin Laden, and they were from the 9/11 era. And from the different relationships and how AQAP has always taken a more of that central role. So I do think those, like you said, Colin, I think it's hard to see them as the formal organizations that we think of them in that sense. I think more of a fluid, different things moving up at the same time. So I think they're operating very differently than how they used to be in the 9/11 era. And I think just to like focus on that one point, I think a lot of policymakers and Western experts are stuck in that 9/11 era time, where they still think of these groups as they were back around that time. And I think we should be able to move beyond that and start thinking of them as adaptable actors that continuously adapt to so many factors around them.
Okay. We're running out of time, so let me just hit the last two questions, and I think that'll be it. So I think that's best suited for you, Sarah. James Wakely says the first Ayatollah translated the work of Sayyid Qutb into Persian, and there are clear concordances between Al-Qaeda's ideology and that of the revolution. Is there therefore a room for objective-based strategic coordination becoming underpinned by an ideological and longer-lasting relation?
This is an interesting question, and yes, there are definitely overlaps between Al Qaeda's ideology. I mean, Sayyid Qutb is known, and then between the Persian translation and what he's mentioned. But right now, those two actors, I think, value more. The ideology still differs. I mean, even if you go back to the Prophet Muhammad's days and the Islamic Emirates, the where the Shia and the Sunni division has started over there, it will still be a big issue for both in the long term rather than like the short term. In the short term, the Palestinian conflict, which has been the root and the foundation of a lot of these movements, and also in al-Qaeda's propaganda. And then also it's an issue that Iran cares about, the October 7th attacks, then the Iran war. All of those geopolitical events have put the common enemies with Israel and the West front and center for these two. So their cooperation right now is based on the common enemies, on the common objectives. I mean, we've seen Iran in the US invasion in Iraq have tried to do this united Islamic army where it tried to work with Sunni and the Shia groups at the same time to complicate and increase the backlash to the US and its allies in those times. So can that be replicated at this point to, yes, create more tension, create more issues, open up more fronts to the US and to the West geographically? I could definitely see that, but I think long term, the division between the Sunni and Shia would definitely come back into the picture at some point once the front common enemies aren't so much front and center.
Okay, let me go for that last question. Another person says, could these speakers, so I address this to both of you, discuss whether and in what ways ISIS may perceive strategic benefit arising from attacks on Iran or areas where Iranian-backed actors maintain a strong presence in the region?
You can go for it, Colin, first.
I was about to be polite and say ladies first.
Uncomfortable silence, that, Colin. I'm sorry.
So I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind in all of this that we're talking about Daesh and al-Qaeda as if they're equivalent sizes and equivalent strengths, but they're not. I mean, according to the figures that member states have given us, al-Qaeda is somewhere between 24,000 and 33,000 strong. And I have to say, given the events in Mali recently, I wonder if that's an underestimate. At the same time, they said Daesh is between 13 and 17,000 strong. I mean, al-Qaeda is doing pretty well, frankly. If you look at it globally, I mean, it's not under that much pressure. Setting aside any debates about HTS in Syria, it's got an ally in Afghanistan. It's doing very well in Mali. It's doing pretty well in East Africa. It's got AQAP. I mean, it's not doing badly. Daesh, on the other hand, where is Daesh making progress? It's not establishing a physical caliphate anywhere. Al-Ansari's message, which I mentioned earlier, admitted that they are under pressure. It's been a difficult 2 years and with much bloodletting. I think that's the phrase he used. So Daesh is it's very vocal. It's very effective at encouraging or provoking lone actor attacks, but it's not actually on a par with al-Qaeda. I mean, al-Qaeda is the bigger organization and arguably the stronger. It can play a much longer term game than Daesh can. So they will all try and take advantage of the situation and the operations, but AQ kind of doesn't have to in quite the same way that Daesh does. So Daesh needs to demonstrate its credibility and the fact that it's still a current organization. So in some ways, I think the pressure is more on Daesh to be seen to act than it is for al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda wants to co-opt local grievances. It wants to buy into local narratives. Daesh doesn't. Just wants everything to be focused on itself and all about its ideology and its view of the world. It doesn't buy into local grievances. They're generally apostate. They're generally selling out. But al-Qaeda has a different approach, a much longer term approach. So they don't have to take advantage in quite the same way that I think Daesh does in order to prove its continued relevance. I'm seeing Sarah nodding, which means I got
Oh, I couldn't agree more. You know my views on the whole Al-Qaeda ISIS debate. And yes, I mean, ISIS has taken territory before, has done all these things, has conducted attacks, but sometimes there's value in looking at things as Colin mentioned, the silence, the deliberation, the actual progress. Numbers, yes, they matter in some aspects, but also attacks are sometimes viewed as weaknesses, as trying to cause noise to get international attention. It's not usually a sign of strength, and I think we should start looking at different indicators when we're evaluating these groups and where they stand on like strength versus not strength or weaknesses, because attacks and numbers don't always translate as strength or power or actual threat. And I think the way Colin described it, I mean, it's definitely how I see it as well. Al-Qaeda is playing the long game, has always played the long way. It's very strategic. It has veterans, it has more older generation, it has more mature thinking, more military thinking with Saif al-Adil and like Al-Qussi. So it definitely is playing a different approach, which, yes, I agree with Colin. Where is ISIS progressing besides inciting those individual lone wolf attacks or putting up propaganda? And it seemed even, and I'm sure you both have seen the statement where ISIS put out a statement calling Al-Qaeda an Iranian proxy, as in to like bring that tension into kind of like put pressure and maybe take away from like Al-Qaeda and the Iran question. So it's definitely interesting to see how these two groups interact and the differences between them. But I couldn't agree more with Colin that Al-Qaeda is the group that is definitely progressing. I mean, if we look at just Africa, Somalia, Janum and the Sahel and Mali, I mean, AQAP in Yemen, like even Al-Qaeda core in Afghanistan, which no one wants to talk about Afghanistan at this point, but like it's also worth talking about this. So it is definitely very, very interesting. And as right now with the World Cup heating up and like things in the US, it would be interesting to keep an eye on how the terrorism landscape is going to shift or if anything's going to happen there.
Well, I mean, with this question, we conclude the event. I mean, it was not without a reason that we thought this was a timely event. It has been really great. I mean, let me thank you one more time for sharing your expertise. Let me thank our audience for being so engaging and for your thoughtful participation. Of course, to our technical team for making everything possible. I really hope it has been engaging. It has been for me and really, really informative. I mean, I believe for a general and specialized audience. It goes without saying that we look forward to welcoming you all again soon. I mean, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on future events, activities, publications at www.extremism.gwu.edu. Of course, follow us on Twitter, Blue Sky, on YouTube, sorry, where you'll find also these recording. And thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.